Yung Ma'am Sarah.
Ah, hello, hi ma'am. Are we already live on
Ay,
YouTube?
si Mon po ito.
Ay,
Yes, ma'am.
hello. Hello,
Opo.
Richmond.
Okay na po ba na I'll make you the host na po?
Oo, kaya lang, okay lang ba if, I give you yung edited version nitong,
I can share naman na po. Para
unshare and also stop recording.
para pa din na po kayo mag-share. Sige po. I'll make you the host na po, ma'am. Bali, re-record naman na po and we're live na po on YouTube.
Richmond, does this go directly to YouTube already?
Yes, ma'am.
I see. Okay, sige, please make me host na. Thank you.
Done po, ma'am. Mauna na po ako, ma'am, para makawi na po ako. Sige po.
All right. Okay, thank you. Thanks so much,
Sige
Richmond.
po, ma'am.
Bye.
Hi, Prof. De Fiesta. Good evening.
Hi, good evening.
Hello. Would you like to try sharing your screen?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I gave you co-hosting abilities.
Okay, sige, please.
Thank you. And also, can I request you to? I'll just put it on the chat.
I just sent my bio note pala.
I
I'm
see.
not sure.
Alright.
Just now, sorry, I just saw your email kasi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Share screen. I'll try that. Okay. Share. Can you see it? Nakikita ba? Hindi?
Yes, I can see it
Okay,
clearly.
okay. So,
Thank you.
yeah, I'll try. Okay, so stop share na ako. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Prof. June.
Hello.
Good evening.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello, good evening. Magandang gabi.
Gandang gabi. I'll give you co-hosting abilities so you can try sharing your screen. Hold on. It's possible to allow several people to share screens.
I think so. If you make them co-host. Hi, JC.
Yeah,
Hi, Ma'am Gay.
but the thing is, like, like after I made the Prof. June co-host, no, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
Thanks. You can now share your screen. Thank you.
Let me check if that works. One moment. Screen. Does it work?
Yes, I can see your screen clearly. Thank you.
Right. Thanks.
Prof. June, sorry to just ask this now, but can I ask you to email me your bio note?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Thank
One
you.
moment. Bio note.
Hi, Sir Dokoy. Good evening. I
Hello,
made
hi,
you
Sam.
co-host. Can you try sharing your screen?
Yes. Share screen. Nasa na ba yung aking...
Got it.
Yeah.
I can see it.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
No. Sino pang wala?
Just well, Dr. Pernia and Jeff. Jeff is coming in a bit. Just
Okay.
Nagbukas na sa ate mo.
Good evening to everyone. Dr. Pernia, sir, I'll make you co-host. If you have a PowerPoint that you'd like to share, you can try doing so.
I have a PowerPoint. How do I share now?
I'll make you co-host.
Yes. Ano pala kulang-kulang ilaw? Okay. No, yeah, there's okay. Yeah.
You're now good to share, sir. Hi, Ma'am Nelly.
There's there.
Yes, and
It's on.
we have to, I keep on telling you, have to convert this into. Okay, so then I don't know. Share screen. Is it okay now? Are we sharing?
Yes, you're sharing your screen. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Professor Sarah.
We'll just wait a bit for Prof. Rosalie. She's not yet in. Ma'am, may I ask you to stop sharing for a bit? Thank you.
Right, okay, thank you. I really have to fix it. Right, that's the problem with this one. Okay, I have a problem with that. Okay, stop sharing.
Thank you.
Hello,
Hi, Sir
Sarah.
Mahar. Good evening. Hi, Ma'am Rosalie. Hello.
Sorry,
Thanks for coming.
I just rushed back. I went downstairs to grab some breakfast.
So are you done? I hope you're done having your breakfast.
Yeah, I was done. Yeah, I quickly grabbed the bike because the breakfast for the hotel for the participants they've arranged. It's all arranged for us. There's we can't pack them and bring in them to our room. I have to make sure the breakfast it will be gone by the time we're over. The session is over.
Okay, so at least you're good. Hi, Sir Fabelia. Good evening.
Hello. Good evening.
And yeah, good evening. Good evening to the rest of our participants. My dad's also here. All right.
How about this?
Okay,
I'm the first speaker.
Yeah.
Sarah, I'm sorry. I just realized. Did I forward all of the?
It's all right. It's all right. I have them. With me.
Very good.
So
Okay,
you'll
very
just take care of the.
open forum.
I'll request the open forum. I'll request you to please introduce Jeff and me.
Yeah. Do I have your paki-forward ngayon yung bio note ninyo. I have to look for it. I'm sorry. Hindi ko makita. Bio note. That's it. Bio note.
All right, I just forwarded it to you.
Okay.
Si Pernia. Dito si Pernia. Siya mas speaker pala. Pernia.
I got it.
Got it.
Sarah.
Thank you. All right, so it's now 7 p.m. We'll start in about 3 minutes. We've paused recording for a bit. The order of the presentation is so Dr. Pernia will go first, and then Dr. Capuno, and then Jeff and myself, then Dr. De Fiesta and Prof. Espia. I think there will be a question and answer forum after Jeff's and my presentation. Is that right?
Yes.
Prof. Rosalie?
Yes, that's correct.
All
Yeah.
right.
So we break it down just to make sure people don't have to wait too long for the questions, and then we move on to the next set. One more thing, Sarah. There's a typo actually in the title of Dr. De Fiesta's presentation. I didn't have the time to alter the poster anymore. She's doing micro rather than macro. And in your field, it's one that
right.
is the difference. Yeah. So please note that it's micro.
Got it.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Welcome.
Hi, Rosalie. Wow.
Hello, Ma'am Giselle.
You brought
Good,
the house
good
down.
morning, good evening po. Yeah, I made it here. Yes, yeah.
You brought the house down there.
Yeah.
President Giselle
Thank
is
you.
President Giselle is ubiquitous. She's in all fora.
No, well,
How she does it.
I know
I'm
such
so
energy.
exhausted, to be honest, Ernie. I am so, and we have to do business meeting later. So that's what I'm concerned about now. But I think this rec is so important. So I'm here. And it's my fourth rec parallel session.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
You should have listened to Rosalie the other night. She brought the house down.
But we'll watch the video recording.
Grabe, that's the Rosalie I know, and I expected to be.
Thank you so much, Mom. I had like, it was tough because I was following after the Nobel Prize winner and the lunch. Yes, I was like, oh, I gotta get them, interested because there's lunch waiting and we can see them preparing the lunch by the patio. Yeah.
No, pero you meet friends with many of them, I'm sure, no?
Yes, yeah. It's a very great. It's a great group. In fact, I'm joining the picnic today, Ma'am Giselle.
That's so great.
So at noon, we're all going to the house of Leah Croucher to have the picnic. Yeah.
And then one day they'll go to Iloilo. You're gonna host them.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. There's plenty of questions. Yeah. Si Mario saying na Rosalie po sa Iloilo. Yeah, sure.
Ganda ng Iloilo. Ay, anyways. Ernie, talagang malapit na ako sumuko, to be honest.
I attended you did good. I attended the RTD last night, Ma'am Giselle, until 10. So that was very good.
We
Yeah.
just have to move it. Talagang we really have to make it SIPA. I'm sorry. We have to. We have to help the DOST, Ernie. You think?
Yes.
Oo. So, baka yung context ng paper na we are planning, P. Ernie, baka in the context na of Science for Change program in support of that. Okay na din yon, di ba?
Okay.
Well, if you don't want to be a partisan, because nga it is going to be presented to all the presidential candidates and even the provincial and other local candidates, kung sino yung may interest at nakakaintindi. Kahit itong mga provincial governors natin, bukas si Governor Abet andon sa ating MOU signing. Ang kanyang kapatid is the one who filed the candidacy. Nagpalit lang silang dalawa. Si Governor Abet will run for Congress and then the congressman will now run for governor.
Yeah. Excuse me, but it's now 7:04. Let's start in a minute. Okay, I'll start recording as well.
Sorry, Eric.
All right, so let's start. Good evening to our participants in the Philippines and good morning to our participants in the US. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Philippine American Academy of Scientists and Engineers, or PAASE, Research Cluster 13's parallel session in the 2021 Annual PAASE Meeting and Symposium. My name is Sarah Dawe Ducanes, Associate Professor at the UP School of Economics and Co-Chair of PAASE Rec 13, the Social Sciences, Economics, and Political Cluster in PAASE. With me is Dr. Rosalie Arcala Hall, who is a professor of political science in the University of the Philippines, Visayas, and she is going to co-chair this session now. We are also live streaming on YouTube, so welcome to our viewers on YouTube. We are privileged to have 5 paper presentations today. Each presentation is allotted around 15 to 18 minutes. After the first 3 paper presentations, we will have a short Q&A session, which will be moderated by Professor Hall. And should you have any questions during any of the presentations, you may opt to place them in the chat box below, and we'll get to them during the open forum. Or, of course, he may air them orally during the open forum. Right? So without further ado, we shall introduce our first speaker.
No more introductions, Sarah.
I think it's
yeah, so we can save time.
oh, but are you sure, sir? Okay, so without further ado, may I let's please welcome Professor Ernesto M. Pernia, former Secretary of Socio-economic Planning, National Economic and Development Authority, and also Professor Emeritus at the UP School of Economics.
Oh. Yeah, so may I share my
yes, please.
Screen? Yes, okay. All right. So the title of my presentation is Health and Economy. We reap what we sow. Actually, it should be we sow the wind and we reap the whirlwind. But that's too drastic. Yeah, because this is somewhat of a critique of how our COVID-19 pandemic has been handled. So next slide. So this is the structure of my presentation. It's pretty straightforward. All I'm saying is that 2020 was a horrible year. We thought that this year would be a better year, but it's not. It's just the same as last year. Next slide. Okay, so health and economy are actually organically related because they're interactive. One affects or influences the other. There's really no trade-off essentially between the two. It's more the trade-off would be just the timing of intervention. So in this coronavirus pandemic, our poor health system capacity to begin with should have started very early with lockdown, targeted or localized and eased as health system capacity improved. Unfortunately, we started very late, moved slowly, and was conservative in spending on the as COVID response. So our economic performance, the good and the bad. This is the good. This is between 2016 and 2019, when the economy was hitting 6.6% per annum growth rate. It was poised to become an upper middle income country in 2020, but it was, of course, dislodged by the pandemic. Inflation was kept within the growth range target. Unemployment was at its lowest. Also, the underemployment was at its lowest. And poverty was also historically at a contemporary, historically low of 16.7%. So, pretty good, numbers in between 2016 and 2019. The bad, this is where we had economic contractions in all quarters of 2020, and the full year growth was negative 9.5%, and the outcome contraction was even worse than projected by many international finance agencies. And in 2020, it's covered. I have 2021 also, but it's covered by that's all right. So anyway, 2021, I think the government has adjusted its growth rate to between 3 and 5%, or no, 4 and 5%, 4 to 5%. But many companies like International Institute of Finance is projecting growth rate to be only 3.4%. And ADB is more optimistic of a growth of something like 4.5%, and also IMF and the World Bank. Oh, next slide. Okay, let me. I have to move fast because I'm limited. So, so we are in a sorry. We have this sorry reputation of highest the COVID caseload in this part of Asia and the longest economy to recover. I think everybody knows that by now. This is attributable to our comparatively inadequate health system capacity and government's paltry, stingy COVID response spending. Despite the fact that we are borrowing a lot, that really is very baffling to me. We have borrowed, I think, about 75 US billion dollars, $75 billion, and we are only spending. Last year we were spending about 23 billion US dollars, and this year it has been increased to 30 billion US dollars. So where is that difference of about 45 billion US dollars? Where did that go? So, you know, and there's no accounting there. So anyway, so let's hope that the mystery will unravel later. So our social infrastructure and you know, our health hospitals and health centers are rather inferior compared with our ASEAN neighbors. And then, so let's move on. This is next slide. This is the this is the compensation, annual salary of healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, and medical technologists. We are really at the bottom of the pile. And if you compare ourselves with Vietnam, which is our closest in terms of per capita GNI now, we are really about half. We are paying about half of what Vietnam is paying its healthcare workers, especially nurses and medical technologists. And as you know, and you must have heard you must have seen in the papers that there has been a long delay in their allowances, in their remuneration, in their payment for what do you call this, risk allowances. So next slide, please. So you can expect that, you know, they are forced to work, of course, but they are probably not as well motivated as their counterparts in ASEAN neighbors. Next slide. These are the salaries in the Philippines. These are the salaries of nurses in the Philippines. Next slide. Okay, next slide, please. In terms of hospitals per 10,000 population, we're still at the bottom. These are old numbers, but you know, not much has really changed over the last few years. And if the other countries have changed, we probably have not changed much from where we were in 2014. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the COVID response spending. It's now 30 billion US dollars. It's about 8.7% of GDP. But compared with our ASEAN neighbors, malayo talaga. Malaysia is much higher. Thailand also much higher than we are spending. Vietnam, this was the number of Vietnam last year. But because they have handled the pandemic quite well, they have not increased their COVID response spending. So we were also below Vietnam last year, but now we are a little bit higher because we have increased it to 30 billion. And also in terms of per capita spending, you can see that we're also kind of a cellar dweller here. Next slide. These are the budget deficits and government to GDP ratios. And well, we are, you know, as I've said, we are borrowing heavily. And so we have comparable or around mid-range of the borrowing debt to GDP ratio here. But what I was saying is that I do not see where the bulk of the borrowings are going, because the borrowings were done because of the COVID pandemic. And so other expenditure items would have been covered already by the GAA. So the 75 billion was really for the COVID response, but it's only 30 billion has been used out of that bulk of money of borrowings. Next slide. Okay, these are the credit ratings, and these hardly changed since last year, or it did not change at all. And I think it's because the credit rating agencies have adjusted their norms, their criteria for rating countries owing to the pandemic. So they know that countries were in difficult straits, and so they had to adjust their credit ratings. So not much change. So they have kept the credit ratings the same as before the pandemic. Next slide. Okay. The implications here is that we are where we are because we have failed to spend or sow adequately in health, human capital, healthcare workers, and social infrastructure. And then, so despite ramping up our COVID response spending, we have not, our ASEAN neighbors, despite their ramping up of COVID response spending, their credit ratings were kept intact. But I think on our side, we were at first, very cautious in borrowing because we wanted to preserve our credit rating. But there was really no need for that, and that is why when the authorities realized that the credit rating agencies maintain their criteria, we borrowed a lot this year. We really ramped it up to 61% of GDP, our borrowings. So a difference of 40% before pandemic, it's 61%. So it increased by 21%, our borrowings relative to GDP. Next one. Oh, okay. What we should or could have done? Okay. Since the pandemic has to do with public health and the economy, the authorities, the IATF, this IATF group, they meet I think every other day or twice a week or 3 times a week. And it is chaired by the Secretary of Health. No, but then because the pandemic is hitting not only health but also the economy, it should have been co-chaired by the economic side. On the economic side, by perhaps NEDA or maybe the head of the economic team, but that was not the case. So many of the decisions of the IATF were more, reflective of those in the military, because many of the members of the IATF are military people. So and then instead of continuous lockdowns, we should have emphasized testing, contact tracing, isolation, and treatment. And our testing should be free, as in other countries. But here we have people have to pay for testing, and it's quite a hole in the pocket of many people, especially the lower income members of our population. So that is really what we failed to do. More systematic testing, contact tracing, isolation, and treatment, and also free, so that everybody will present themselves for testing. Otherwise, they will avoid being tested because of the cost. Okay, so next slide. And so here, sowing to reap in the short run, I have several proposals here. I am saying that we should really strengthen public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships are not very welcome by the Department of Finance. I have been pushing for more public-private partnerships, and because it really, there's expertise in the part of the private sector, and we are trying to welcome foreign direct investments, but we are rather restrictive on domestic investments in infrastructure through public-private partnership. So, okay, so much higher spending should have been made on, to improve our health system capacity, and that is what Vietnam's they only did not start their addressing health, the pandemic early. They also right away strengthened the health system capacity, which we did not. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then sowing to reap in the medium to long run. It's a long list here, and I think I'm already beginning to exceed my time. Dr. Sarah, Professor, do I still have a couple of minutes?
You can have 3 more minutes to finish.
3 more minutes. Okay. So these are, common sense, nothing magical here in terms of recommendations on what to do. Okay. And so we should pass the PSA, FIA, and the Retail Trade Liberalization Act. That has been pending for a long time. Also, Department of Water, not the Department of Overseas Filipino Workers, because we are not encouraging that. OFWs. We are trying to keep them here, and as much as possible, and we need to provide employment here. Okay. Then, in terms of FDI, we are the most restrictive in ASEAN. We have so many restrictions. It's usually 40% foreign and 60% local. But in Vietnam, it's 100% in all areas and activities of the economy. That's why they're getting $30 billion annually. We are getting about what? A paltry 2 to 3 billion. Well, the highest we were able to hit in 2017 was 9 billion, almost $10 billion. But that was the summit. We have not gone beyond that. And then, so we should vigorously invest in science and technology and innovation. And this is in line with PAASE's interest, and which should be of interest to everybody. And we talked about it a lot this morning during the panel discussion. Okay, let's next slide. Let's go. And this is my last slide, sowing to reap in the medium to longer run. And this is about we really had, in terms of population management, we really have this. That's really a huge missed opportunity. The estimate is that the demographic transition through fertility reduction accounts for about 1/3 of growth, of economic growth in developing countries. So we are missing that kind of that amount of economic growth because we have neglected, and that's because of the Catholic Church hierarchy, of course, that opposed family planning and the population management program. Boldly invest in nature, which is what Pope Francis said. Nature is our home, our common home. And then we should invest in virology and vaccinology so that we don't have to be dependent on other countries. Okay, and then we need to develop a sense of urgency, what I call virtuous impatience, so that we get things done faster. I think in ASEAN we have the highest tolerance level, forbearance level. Mañana na, bukas na, sige na lang, pwede na habit. Parang ano eh. So, and that also affects our output in terms of the economy and in terms of health services. Okay, finally, and I'm just saying that if we do the above and others that will be proposed by my co-panelists here, my co-speakers here, I think we will be able to move toward the objective of the Philippine Development Plan 2017 to 2022 post-pandemic, namely to lay the foundation for inclusive growth, a high trust and resilient society, and a globally competitive economy. Sana. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pernia, for a very interesting talk, for giving us an overview of what has been done during the pandemic and sharing us your experienced views on managing the pandemic in the economy and sowing to reap in the medium to longer term. And so with that, again, if you have any questions, you may place them on the chat box. We'll get to them when we have the open forum after the third presentation. Okay, so we now move on to our next speaker. Okay, our next speaker is Joseph J. Capuno, Dr. Joseph J. Capuno, who is a professor at the UP School of Economics. He has published articles in public economics, including on fiscal decentralization, political economy, local public finance, on development economics, topics involving equity, regional growth, 4Ps, fertility choice, schooling decisions, and on health economics, in terms of randomized experiments on health insurance and primary care for CVDs, health-seeking behavior, health finance, UHC, impact evaluations of WASH interventions, and clean fuel for cooking. So our next speaker is indeed a well-published guy. Please welcome with me, Dr. Capuno.
Hello, good morning, good evening. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody, for attending our session. I also like to thank the conference and session organizers, Dr. Rosalie Alcalahol and Dr. Sarah Lynn Daway-Ducanes, for this opportunity. I am going to present a study on local government responses to the COVID-19 crisis in the Philippines. This is a paper written with two UPSC students, JT Alvarez and John Meginto. The paper is originally prepared for a volume on the politics of local government responses to the pandemic, edited by one of the organizers, Dr. Rosalie Alcalahol. Okay, to provide a brief background and motivation to our study, I'll present a heat map of the local responses of some cities in the Philippines. Soon after the first case of community transmission of COVID-19 in early March 2020, the national government framed its approach for addressing the pandemic as a national government-enabled but LGU-led government and society response. This means that local governments are not only expected to follow the national government directives, but also initiate their own measures to contain the spread of the COVID-19 virus and mitigate its health and economic impacts. This heat map shows the responses of the cities in the National Capital Region, or Metro Manila, over the period March 2020 to March 2021. Following Hale et al. 2021, the local responses are broadly classified here as containment and closure, health system responses, economic responses, and other types or miscellaneous. Some of the responses, especially those classified as containment and closure, are instigated or inspired by national government directives. So when the national government declared a state of calamity, for example, some local governments did the same, so that they may also use their public funds earmarked for calamity relief operations. Other local responses are distinct from national initiatives, however, such as community kitchens, internet subsidy, or designation of bicycle lanes. This is to encourage the use of bicycles when jeepneys and buses were not allowed to ply their usual routes. Some local responses bunch up in some months. Yeah. For example, many of the containment and closure measures were adopted in March to May 2020, the same months that also saw many health system responses and economic responses. Then again, in early 2021, we saw more of the health system measures. This is another heat map showing the types and timing of local pandemic responses in selected cities outside Metro Manila. We also observe broadly similar patterns in the timing and timing of many of these responses. No doubt the types and timing of the local responses are correlated, if not determined, by local outbreaks or incidents, population density, and mobility and health service capacity. However, there are also adjacent cities that exhibit same epidemiological curves, similar population and health service capacity, and yet have dissimilar responses. To the extent that different responses lead to different impact or outcomes, we also want to understand their sources or drivers. So in our study, we want to examine the patterns in the types and timing of local government responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And more pointedly, to seek the evidence for one-upmanship among incumbent local government officials. In other words, we want to understand how political incentives faced by the incumbent mayors drive their pandemic responses. We use the word one-upmanship to characterize the behavior of local officials, especially mayors, not to denigrate them. That is, we use the word one-upmanship not to imply nagyayabangan or they're engaged in a pissing contest. Pardon my choice of words. Rather, we use one-upmanship to describe a strategy of local government officials to credibly signal their competence and sincerity as leaders to their constituents. Besides, it's fun doing. For the fun of doing the study, we hope that our findings could provide inputs to policy discussions concerning the incentives for improving local public service provisions in the country. This is important because local government enjoys fiscal autonomy under Local Government Code of 1991. Moreover, the findings could add to a better understanding of local government behavior, especially under crisis situation. We frame one-upmanship as an application of the yardstick competition model of Besley and Case, which was published in 1995. In this model, the incumbent leader, the city mayor in this case, seeks re-election. To win, she has to convince the local voters about her merits as a leader. Voters want a competent or sincere leader than an inept or a crooked one. However, they do not have all the relevant information about the incumbent's true quality. Their observations or experiences about local public services provide only imperfect guides. The quality, adequacy, or timeliness of services is only partly due to the incumbent's competence. The local government's inherent fiscal and organizational capacity, market conditions, national directives, and even the natural environment are important contributing factors. So an inept but lucky mayor may still run a local government with superb public services. So one way for the incumbent then to overcome the voters' lack of information or even disbelief is measure herself up against another mayor. That is by outperforming her peer in the eyes of her own constituents. For this to work, for this model to work, two other conditions are essential. One is that the performances are comparable and observable. This means that the voters know the responses are driven by the same shock or an exogenous event. The local responses in their own LGUs and in the other LGUs can be observed or known as well. If the other locality is more effective in dealing with the shock, in this case the pandemic, then the voters may infer or may conclude their own leaders to be incompetent and decide not to re-elect her. The other condition is that the comparison will improve the incumbent's chances of to another term. At the extreme, when the incumbent faces a term limit, she may not care to outperform other mayors or be outshone by them. If she's running unopposed or faces weak political pressure, say membership in a dominant political dynasty or political clan, then she may also not care about being perceived as a laggard when compared to her to the other mayors. To the extent that these conditions are satisfied, one-upmanship in local responses may be observed. In the next slide, we show how we sifted the types and timing of local responses for evidence of one-upmanship. To find evidence consistent with the prediction of the yardstick competition model, that is the one-upmanship, we selected 25 cities for our case study. We chose cities because of their relatively high population density, comparable health services capacities, physical accessibility, which are broadly correlated with the spread and incidence of COVID-19 cases. We also chose cities with fairly complete information about their COVID-19 cases, their local responses, socioeconomic and political characteristics, especially for the study period March 2020 to March 2021. To have a geographical spread, we have cities both inside and outside the NCR. NCR cities are more frequently subject to NG interventions or media attention and therefore may respond to the pandemic differently from cities outside Metro Manila. To satisfy the assumptions of the YC model or the yardstick competition model, we chose cities that are neighbors. Neighbors in the sense that they share the same physical border or land boundary, or they are perceived to have the same socioeconomic or political status in the same province or region. Beyond this criteria, we selected the cases for convenience, given the time and resource constraints. There's no attempt to make our sample to be representative. We have a total of 16 cities in NCR, and these 16 cities are organized into two clusters. Remember, a cluster is a pair or a trio of neighboring cities. We also have two cities in Central Luzon constituting one cluster. These are Gapan and Cabanatuan. Two cities in Western Visayas, Iloilo and Bacolod. They don't share a land border, but they are seen in the same, economic and political status together. Cebu, Mandaue, and Lapu-Lapu in the Cebu province, constituting three clusters. So one cluster will have Cebu and Mandaue, for example. Another cluster will have all three. And then Northern Mindanao region, Cagayan, De Oro, and Iligan, constituting another cluster. Okay, now we now established that the cities in for our case studies faced a common shock over the same period. This slide shows the 7-day moving average of the daily attack cases for each of the 25 cities. The first 16 graphs are for the NCR cities. We see the cases across the cities to have surged in July to November 2020. The epidemiological curve are more or less the same in the sense that the period over which the surges or the peaks occurred more or less in the same months across cities. Cebu, Mandaue, and Lapu-Lapu together have roughly similar temporal patterns in cases, as do Gapan and Cabanatuan, Iligan, and Cagayan de Oro at the bottom of the bottom slide. However, relatively less similar are Iloilo and Bacolod. Iloilo seems to have a longer period of high incidence rates than Bacolod, as you can see here. The other key assumption is that both the mayors and voters care enough to know about the local pandemic responses, what is happening within their jurisdictions and also in the neighboring local governments. This is admittedly, this is hard to verify with secondary sources. We don't know exactly what local voters know. We didn't have time or resources to run a survey, and media coverage are spotty and incomplete. But we know that some cities, especially in Metro Manila, for example, Manila, Marikina, Quezon City, are always covered by the regular media. But other cities are not as well covered by regular media. So the best that we can come up with here is the tally of the data from Twitter trends, which we reproduce in this graphs. Here we simply tally the tweets that mention the names of the cities or the mayors of these cities on those days when local responses are introduced versus all other days. Yeah. Here we see the tweets are far more frequent. For example, on those days when a pandemic response is introduced. For example, if you look at the first graph, Caloocan, on those days a local response was introduced. The cumulative number of tweets, these are in thousands, almost hundreds, thousands, 40,000, versus in other days. And there are more days when there are no responses are introduced, are a lot lower, a lot less. Sa Valenzuela, Malaki, Quezon City, as you can see, the tweets are more frequent on those days when a local response is introduced, except in Bacolod, are even number of tweets. At tapos sa Lapu-Lapu din and sa Lapu-Lapu din. But if you average this out, there are fewer days where there was a local response, so on a per day basis, mas mataas pa rin itong tweet count dapat dito sa Bacolod at saka Lapu-Lapu versus on those days when no pandemic response was introduced. But unfortunately, this only covers the period March 2020 to September 2020. Twitter stopped gathering this information after September 1. Key characteristics, finally, we have to establish the re-election incentives of the incumbent mayors as well. This table shows their term status, membership in political dynasties, the margin of votes over their closest rivals, and the number of rivals they had in the last elections. This was in May 2018. Some mayors are on their third and final term in office, so they are not eligible to run for the same position next year, but they may run for another position, anoint their family members to succeed them in the same position, or again after a three-year break. Some mayors like Marcy Teodoro of Marikina and Edgerson Pascual of Gapan ran unopposed in the last election. Edgar Labella of Cebu won with a very slim margin, only 3%, as you can see here, or 4%. Again, the hypothesis is that mayors are likely to engage in one-upmanship if that will improve their chances to another term. Put differently, we are likely to observe one-upmanship when the mayors are still eligible to run for another term, or they face a strong political competition, other things being equal. Okay, so finally the results. For each cluster, remember a cluster is a pair or a trio of local governments that share the same, that are neighbors, either in the physical sense or in this in economic or political sense. For each cluster, we also measure a temporal clustering here, which we define to be the number of times a pandemic response of one LGU and that of its neighbors are within a month of each other. So sequential yung pag-introduce nila, but not too far apart in time. We measure that they should be within a 30-day period after the first one was introduced. This is to allow for some responses some responses kasi require sanggunian resolution, and that takes a lot of time. Some responses would require lengthy bidding process for procurement. That takes some time as well. So we thought that a 30-day period would be a fair window to measure temporal clustering. So one group has high temporal clustering, so greater than 50% of the time, meaning the local responses are within a month of each other. And then another group have low temporal clustering, less than 50% of the time. Then for each group, so high temporal clustering and low temporal clustering, we verified which pair or triad of neighboring cities had mayors with the political incentives to engage in one-upmanship. This is basically verifying whether the incumbent mayors are eligible to run or they face a strong political competition. In the paper, we also further characterize the local governments in terms of whether they are they're the first one to introduce an intervention, or innovator. They don't simply mimic the leader; they introduce their own intervention. Then we classify the times whether the same LGU is both the leader and innovator. But being leader and innovator is not necessarily an implication of the yardstick competition model. We just have to do this to further characterize local government responses. Of the 19 clusters with high temporal clustering, so there are 19 of these with high temporal clustering, 17 satisfy the assumptions and predictions of the yardstick competition model. Of the 9 clusters with low temporal clustering, 2 do not satisfy the assumptions and prediction of the yardstick competition model. Okay, so this one they satisfy, and we observe clustering of responses. This one do not satisfy the yardstick competition model assumption, and we do not observe temporal clustering. Together, we think that their behavior are consistent with the prediction of the yardstick competition model. To be sure, the model, however, is not perfect. There are 2 with high temporal clustering and yet do not satisfy the yardstick competition assumption. Also, there are 7 that satisfy the yardstick competition assumption and yet exhibit low temporal clustering. But all in all, of the 28 cluster, we observed 19 to be consistent, to be behaving consistently with the predictions of the yardstick competition model. So finally, to conclude, examining the types and patterns of pandemic responses of selected cities inside and outside NCR, we see some evidence of one-upmanship consistent with the predictions of the yardstick competition model. Note, however, that our evidence are only consistent with and are not necessarily there to refute or to affirm the yardstick competition model. Due to data limitations, we're not able to run regression models and perform the usual statistical tests to establish causality. And this will be the subject of future study. With that, I end my presentation. Thank you very much. Sarah, over to you. I hope I did not exceed my time too much. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dokoy, Dr. Capuno. I again enjoyed this presentation. As a political scientist, it really dovetails the sort of interest that we have in analyzing public policy. We're very fresh insight, I'd say, in trying to kind of ascertain or think about motivations of local government officials, why they opt for one or another type of response to the pandemic. So following Dr. Capuno, our third presenter are Dr. Geoffrey Ducanes and Dr. Sarlene Salvador Daway Ducanes, who will be talking about the impact of the pandemic on employment. So Dr. Geoffrey Ducanes is an associate professor of Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Economics. In 2014, he was awarded as Outstanding Young Scientist in the field of economics by the National Academy of Science and Technology. He specializes in applied econometrics and has published in the areas of international migration, education, poverty, and inequality. Dr. Sarlene Salvador Daway Ducanes, also the PAASE Rec 13 co-chair, is an associate professor at the University of the Philippines School of Economics, from which she also obtained her BS Economics degree summa cum laude in 2003 and MA Economics degree in 2005. She earned her PhD in economics from the University of California, Riverside in 2012. Her research interests include macroeconomic theory, monetary theory and policy, and selected topics in development economics. They will co-present. Take it away, Geoffrey and Sarah.
Thank you very much, Prof. Rosalie. Good evening again to everyone. The title of our presentation of the paper that we're presenting is The Extensive and Intensive Impacts of a Hard Lockdown on Employment During the COVID-19 Pandemic, the Philippine Experience. So as Prof. Rosalie said, this is co-written with my husband, Jeff. All right, so the International Labour Organization states that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on employment in 2020 was catastrophic. 8.8% of work hours were lost, equivalent to about 255 million full-time equivalent jobs or FTE jobs. Now, FTE is the ratio of the employee's scheduled work hours to the employer's hours for a full-time work week of about 45 hours. According to the ILO estimate. 50% of these work hour losses were due to employment losses, while 50% were due to a drop in work hours. Now, total labor income losses were equivalent to about 4.4% of world GDP in 2020. Now, it's good to note that when we say total weekly work hours, this is the product of paid employment times the average weekly work hours. And so we see here that variations or changes in total weekly hours can be explained by changes in paid employment. And so that what constitutes what's called extensive labor margins, while changes in average weekly work hours which can also explain changes in total weekly work hours, constitute what's called intensive labor margins. Now, in what was an unprecedented event by April 2020, around 3.9 billion people in over 90 countries, okay, so this is accounting for around half the world's population, were in some form of lockdown. Now, lockdowns were viewed as a necessary short-term measure imposed to contain the spread of the virus. However, these lockdowns came with large immediate economic costs, primarily in terms of massive income and employment losses, which were particularly more severe on the more vulnerable groups of society. Now, the ILO, International Labour Organization, in its June 2020 report says that by April 15, 2020, around 55 million workers all over the world were significantly impacted by the lockdown measures in terms of reduced work hours and loss of incomes. By May 15 of the same year, this number surged to about 74 million workers. This is around 76 to 80% of these, well, around 76 to 80% of these workers were in informal employment, implying that these workers, due to an inopportune combination of income loss, inadequate income support, and access to social security measures, we're highly vulnerable to falling even deeper in poverty. Now, the year-on-year quarter two drop in global working hours was about 17%. This is a loss of about 495 million FTE jobs, according to the ILO in its September 2020 issue. Now, they say that this drop in working hours, global working hours, can be primarily attributed to a drop in intensive margins. That means average work hours rather than extensive margins or loss of employment. Now, this graph here shows quarter two unemployment rates in April to May 2020 stringency indices. Now, the stringency index is based on 9 response indicators on containment and closures and travel and mobility restrictions. These measures include school closures, workplace closures, cancellation of public events, restrictions on gathering size, public transport closures and restrictions, stay-at-home requirements, restrictions on internal movement, and restrictions on international travel. Now, this figure here shows that countries that had higher stringency indices, means April to May 2020 averages, that's the blue line here, also tended to have higher unemployment rates, the orange line, with a correlation coefficient of about 0.79, which is quite high. The countries with the highest April to May 2020 stringency indices, well, the Philippines and India in this graph here, okay, so we have India here and in the Philippines, also had the highest unemployment rates. In India, for instance, the unemployment rate reached as high as 25.5% in May 2020. Almost 83% of households suffered from income losses in this month. Now, in the Philippines, the quarter two unemployment rate went as high as about 17.7%. Many of these households reported that they had little to no savings, so that more than a week of lockdown would leave them with little to no means for survival. Okay, now in the ASEAN, the Philippine stringency indices in April and May 2020 were the highest, comparable only to those of India, and considerably higher than the world averages. Okay, so we have here the stringency indices for India, April, May, for the Philippines. Okay, they're quite comparable. And this is the world average here, the world averages. Okay, indeed, the Philippines had one of the strictest and longest lockdowns in the world. Now, this figure here shows that the Philippines, Philippine figures are in red, the red bars, okay, had the highest April, May averages of all the sub-indices for work-related restrictions. That is in terms of restrictions on internal movement, public transport closures, and workplace closures. The public transportation closures in the Philippines in particular constrained the mobility of workers, even in sectors considered essential and were exempt from lockdown measures. This likely further exacerbated the economic effects of the lockdown. Okay, now the Philippine Statistics Authority's April 2020 labor force survey reports that the unemployment rate rose from about 5.1% in April 2019 to an unprecedented 17.7% in April 2020, raising the unemployed workers number by about 5 million. However, the overall picture of the Philippine labor market may be even more dire, since a decline in the number of employed workers was higher at about 8 million workers, as the additional 3 million workers joined the ranks of not in the labor force. And many among those who reported that they were employed had no or reduced incomes due to the work restrictions. This is from Ducanas 2020. Now, this figure here that we have shows that the average number of work hours declined by around 50% from January 2020 to April 2020, looking at the orange bars. Okay, so that's from about 40 hours per week to around 20 hours per week during the height of the lockdown. Meanwhile, the share of the working age population with paid employment, that's the blue line here, declined from around 52% in January 2020 to 42% in April 2020. Okay, so employment outcomes, in particular, in terms of total weekly hours worked, as we said earlier, this equals the number of employed workers or paid employment times the number of weekly hours worked during the pandemic, declined due to several factors. Okay, the first is a fall in aggregate demand, primarily since consumption and investment were down due to income losses, inadequate social protection, loss of consumer and investor confidence, etc. Due to supply chain disruptions due to local and international lockdown measures, social distancing measures that especially affected firms or businesses that are highly sensitive to social distancing measures, such as restaurants, malls, etc. Okay, but and the last one is the hard lockdown, and this is where we'll focus our paper. The mechanism that we'll focus on is the hard lockdown in April and May 2020, which prevented most businesses from operating, and also employees, especially daily wage earners, from going to work and earning incomes. So the objective of our research is to tease out the impact on employment outcomes of the hard lockdown in April 2020 using quasi-experimental difference in differences methodology, or DID. Okay, so again, to accomplish our research objective of teasing out the effects of the hard lockdown on employment outcomes, we use difference in differences analysis. This is a quasi-experimental method appropriate when there is no random assignment of treatment, which is the case in the assignment of areas to be placed on hard lockdown, or ECQ, and when treatment and control groups could differ in important ways. Now, the regression equation we estimated is this, where the difference in difference estimate of the impact of the hard lockdown is captured by this delta here, delta subscript DD. Okay, so looking at the equation that we have, y subscript I GT can either be one of two employment measures. We have the probability of being in paid employment status, so whether or not the individual I, whether or not he's in paid employment, and B, average number of work hours worked in the LFS reference period, that's the week prior to the survey. Now, the analysis is limited only to working age people, or those 15 years and older. A worker is in paid employment if he or she did paid work for at least 1 hour in the previous week, or had a paying job or business, even if no work was done in the previous week. Now, the number of hours worked is an indicator only available for those who were employed. In the Philippines, the standard number of working hours is 8 hours, and the standard number of working days is 5. And so we have a 40-hour work week, which is considered full-time work. Okay, now treat the subscript G here is the treatment indicator, which takes the value 1 if the individual I belongs to the treatment group or ECQ region, and 0 otherwise. Now, post equals 1 if period T is an ECQ period. In our case, that's if the period is April 2020, and 0 otherwise. Okay, the coefficient interaction between treat and post gives the impact of ECQ, or the hard lockdown, on our employment outcomes. And X subscript J I G T is the jth covariate for individual I in period Z, and can be either age, sex, or highest educational attainment. Now over to you, Jeff.
Good day, everyone. So this table just shows which regions we classified as treatment regions, which regions we classified as control regions, and which regions we excluded from the regression analysis. So in the treatment regions, the ECQ regions are NCR, Region 3, and Region 4A. So these are the regions where during the LFS survey in April 2020, they were in lockdown for the entire period. So the control regions are the regions which were never placed under a lockdown during the LFS survey in April 2020. And then the excluded regions, these are the regions where for part of the period when the LFS survey was conducted, either portions of the region or the whole region were under lockdown for part of the time. Next slide, please. And so this table only shows that, so it shows the number of observations that we have for the treatment and control groups. And the sample sizes number in the tens of thousands. So I won't dwell into this. Next slide, please. And then this table only shows that indeed there is a huge difference in the there is a significant difference in the profile of the workers in the treatment group and the control group. So workers in the treatment group are slightly more likely to be women, much more better educated, and more likely to be in industry and the services sector. So there's a difference in profile. Next slide, please. But in the case of again, in the case of a difference in difference analysis, it's okay to have different profiles of the control and treatment groups. The necessary assumption is that the outcomes of interest should have been moving in parallel prior to the application of the treatment. And so this slide, the figures in this slide shows that that is indeed the case. So the period of interest is from April 2019 to January 2020. So in the case of both paid employment rate and also in the number of hours worked, so the outcomes were moving in parallel for both the for the treatment and the control groups. Next slide, please. So table 4 in this slide shows the regression DID estimates of the impact of the hard lockdown on the two employment outcomes of interest using the full sample. So what it shows is that for each employment outcome, so we have two sets of estimates. The first being the basic regression DID model with no covariates, and the second being the extended regression DID with added control variables for sex, age, and education. The probability of paid employment in treatment areas is higher by 0.03 or 3 percentage points. That's the coefficient of the ECQ areas. So this is consistent with the trends that we saw in the previous slide. And then for the next two variables, so note that one can think of the effect of the pandemic and the associated government measures on employment outcomes as the sum of the coefficients of the lockdown period and the DID coefficient, at least for the treatment group. Of course, for the control group, the DID coefficient will be 0. So the coefficient for the lockdown period indicates that the probability of paid employment rate, or the probability of paid employment went down by 0.12 or 12 percentage points for the control group during the pandemic period. The DID coefficient highlighted in yellow is positive but small. It's 0.01 for paid employment. This means that the probability of paid employment declined by slightly less for the treatment group compared to the control group during the pandemic. This is actually contrary to expectation. This unexpected result, we posit, likely stems from government measures during the hard lockdown period that mainly benefited businesses and workers in hard lockdown areas and offset the impact of the hard lockdown itself on paid employment, at least temporarily. Primary among these measures is the COVID-19 Adjustment Measures Program, or CAMP, which provided financial support to affected workers in private establishments that have implemented flexible working arrangements or who closed temporarily due to the pandemic. Because disbursement under this program or the financial support was forced directly to employee payroll accounts and prioritized employers who were compliant with tax and social security regulations, the beneficiaries were primarily formal sector workers who are concentrated in the more urbanized ECQ areas. A moratorium on the firing of national government workers or of government workers during the lockdown period also likely disproportionately benefited ECQ areas where the central government is mainly located, so primarily in NCR. In contrast, if you look at the working hours, the hard lockdown had a large negative impact on hours of work. So weekly hours of work fell by close to 19 hours, or a 45% decline compared to pre-pandemic level. And this estimate was robust to the introduction of covariates.
For eating that. Who was making all this?
The strict social distancing measures The strict social distancing measures put in place the forced closure of many establishments, for example, malls and barbershops, the prohibition of public transportation, and interprovincial travel restrictions meant that even those who were employed were unable to do full-time work or work at all during the hard lockdown. In both regressions, most of the rest of the results conformed to expectations. So for example, average working hours was higher by about 7 hours in the more urbanized ECQ areas. The average number of working hours was slightly increasing with age, higher for men than women, although women were significantly less likely to be in paid employment, and lowest for those with the lowest educational level. Next slide, please. We also ran the regression separately for men and women. So again, note that a requirement here is that the parallel trends assumption also holds separately for men and women. We won't show the graphs anymore because there are too many, but just to note that the parallel trend assumptions also hold if you break the sample into subgroups, including by sex. So the first two columns here pertain to paid employment for males and the next two for females. The last four are for working hours. So paid employment among males in ECQ areas declined less than for males in non-ECQ areas during the lockdown period. However, weekly hours work declined more for males by about 20 hours or 49% compared to the pre-pandemic level. For females, this declined by about 17 hours or 42%. Next slide, please. We also examined the impact by age group. So while paid employment did not decline for those ages 15 to 24, so what we call the youth, weekly hours work declined the most for this age group. Weekly work hours declined by about 21 hours or 55% for those aged 15 to 24, 19 hours or 44% for those aged 25 to 59, and 13 hours or 39% for those aged 60 plus compared to their pre-pandemic levels. Next slide, please. We also ran the regressions by educational attainment. So the impact in working hours was highest among those with incomplete college education, a decline by 22 hours or 52%, and those with incomplete high school education or lower, a decline by about 18 hours or 47% compared to pre-pandemic level. The impact of the hard lockdown was least among those who completed college or those who completed post-secondary. Likely because they are also the most likely to have jobs amenable to work from home and also the ones more likely to be employed in government jobs. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, the hard lockdown in April 2020 had a tremendous impact on working hours or on the intensive margin, and not so much on employment itself or the extensive margin. So again, 45% decline in working hours on average, and employment in lockdown areas did not fall relative to non-lockdown areas. Again, likely because government employment support measures favored lockdown areas. So in a way, government measures blunted the effect of the hard lockdown on paid employment, but they were not able to blunt the effect on working hours. The most affected in terms of lost hours of work were younger workers with low to medium level education. So high school graduates and those with incomplete tertiary education. The workers with these characteristics are more likely to be in the informal sector and to have no work, no pay jobs compared to post-secondary or college graduates who are more likely to be in the formal sector and also more likely to be in jobs amenable to work from home. So this should factor into the design of government alleviation measures. There should be targeted support to no work, no pay workers unable to work during a hard lockdown, as they are the ones rendered the most vulnerable during these periods. This requires the establishment of an information system and the financial infrastructure to make this possible. Infrastructure meaning the mechanism by which the financial assistance can be given to workers in the informal sector, as many remain unbanked and unregistered with government. More broadly, since hard lockdowns are very costly and cause so much hardship, for the government to carefully weigh the use of hard lockdowns, and if they are necessary, to design them in such a way as to limit their negative impact and spill over on the economy and on employment. So hopefully the granular lockdowns that will be put in place will accomplish this. Of course, the first best is still to prevent large outbreaks to more widespread testing, vaccination, and contact tracing. This is the end of our presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah and Jeff. At this point, we will actually have the Q&A, a brief Q&A to entertain a few questions directed to the first three presentations. We will then proceed to the last two presentations after this kind of interim. Okay, so all those who wish to ask or pose a question, you can do so by raising your hand and I will acknowledge you. Or you can type in your questions in the chat box. So there is already one question posted in the chat box. This is from Mr. Babas, who works with the provincial government of Isabela. And his question is directed to Secretary Pernia. Secretary Pernia, Mr. Babas would like to ask your opinion regarding the forthcoming decentralization. What are your thoughts on its timing? Would it be advantageous or disadvantageous to the COVID-19 response?
Can you repeat? I didn't get the first part, because I was...
Yes. What is your opinion regarding the forthcoming decentralization? What are your thoughts regarding its timing? Do you think it would be advantageous or disadvantageous to the COVID-19 response?
Well, is there a plan to decentralize? I'm not familiar with that new policy, if it's a new policy to be implemented. Decentralization. Well, decentralization was enacted in 1992 by, I think, Senator Pimentel. But that thing has not really panned out as expected. So I think some it's not good to legislate decentralization. I think it should happen, optionally or out of market forces rather than being regulated by fiat. It's not good to regulate things by fiat in this kind of situation we have. I mean, in a capitalist economy.
Yes. Secretary Pernia, Mr. Babas was actually referring to the Mandanas ruling. The Mandanas ruling. Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Okay. Well, that's not so much decentralization as increasing the IRA. The internal revenue allotment. it's quite significant increase on the IRA of local governments. So, well, I think it's good if the local government executives are able to absorb and use the funds, efficiently in terms of doing things that are good for the locality, for the province or the region, and it's going to lead to more employment opportunities and more livelihood opportunities that will reduce not only unemployment but also maybe reduce poverty. But then if it's not used efficiently and if it is wasted, then it's not good.
Thank you very much, Secretary Pernia. I don't see any hands raised, but I will pose a question actually to Dr. Capuno. Dr. Capuno, of all the clusters, the pairings or trios that you looked at that scored high in temporal clustering, as well as those that also displayed yardstick competition in your figure, the ones in the upper location. Which particular cluster or pair or trio of local government kind of best exemplify or illustrate this yardstick competition that meets your assumptions, and what do you think is happening? It could be a pairing out of the NCR or out of the NCR, just so we have an idea of which of them actually are behaving in such a manner as you predicted.
I could cite two, Quezon City and Manila. Yeah, these are well. If you look at the assumptions, Isko Moreno, has apparently has higher ambitions. Is eligible to run. I don't think he's very well threatened by any rival in Manila, but apparently he has a higher ambition. When we did this, we didn't know then that he was running for sure as president, but he was very visible in the media. A mere lockdown of a street, or spraying a street with pesticide or insecticide, or he gets a lot of media mileage out of whatever he does. And then Quezon City, I think, is she's under pressure. She has many rivals, and between the two of them, they practically hug the limelight in Metro Manila. For some time, also Bico Soto, Bico Soto and Abi Binay. But these were not really, they didn't stay long as much, or they didn't have as much exposure as Joy Belmonte and Isko Moreno. Yeah, I think those two are really driven by trying to prove something. Yeah, something that either their competence or they care about their voters or about or their sincerity as leaders. They apparently they want to be looked at in a better light than others.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Capuno. That's very interesting indeed, because it leads us into kind of like the psyche, what's the underlying motivation, or why the need to magmayabang, in the part of these LGU city executives. And with the election upcoming, we have an election in less than a year. And certainly people would be looking back at how well they performed in the period under consideration, which is the COVID-19 pandemic response. Okay, is there any more questions from the participants? Okay, So at this point then, we will proceed with the next two presentations. And I will turn over the floor to Sarah again to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Prof. Rosalie. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce our fourth speaker. She is Dr. Gay D. De Fiesta, who is a professor at the Social Sciences Division of UP Visayas. She is co-project leader of the Cultural Heritage Resilience and Sustainability to Multiple Hazards Project, funded by Ched Newton Fund 2020 to 2021. She's a lead researcher for the Social Vulnerability Assessment of Iloilo City barangays under coastal cities at risk. In 2020, project leader of the design, implementation, and social acceptability of controlled release fertilizers from agri-fishery waste materials. This is a Ched Dare 2 funded project from 2018 to the present. And she was also project leader of the evaluation of the impact of the Agricultural Insurance Program of the Philippine Crop Insurance Corporation, or PCIC, on agricultural producers in Region 6, which was a component study of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies' project evaluation of the impact of the PCIC on agriculture, 2016 to 2017. Without further ado, please welcome with me Dr. Gay De Fiesta.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, everyone. Good morning to those who are in the US. My presentation this evening is titled Microscale Social Vulnerability Assessment, Localized Disaster Risk Analysis Applied to COVID-19 in Iloilo City. Let me start with by defining social vulnerability and connecting it to risk assessment. So social vulnerability is socially constructed. It is driven by social, political, historical, and economic processes and structures. It is also a pre-existing condition or an inherent characteristic. So for example, if you are a female in a very patriarchal society, that means you are socially vulnerable. Moreover, social vulnerability also weakens a community's ability to prevent human suffering and financial loss during disasters, and therefore affects resilience of communities. So, social vulnerability and disaster risk. Many studies show that in disaster situations, the socially vulnerable are often adversely affected because they are less likely to recover, that is, due to lack of resources, and prone to injury and death. For example, in major disaster events such as the Bangladesh floods and the Indian tsunami, females are more likely to die, or there is a high incidence of death among females compared to males. That is because they do not have the skills to survive. So what is our study all about? This was conducted in Iloilo City in 2020. Actually, it started in 2019 and spilled over to 2020. It was actually a climate and disaster risk assessment for Iloilo, but the local government unit wanted us to extend that to include COVID-19 as part of that assessment. So what we did is integrate social vulnerability analysis into the disaster risk assessment. So what is our objective? The objective is to see how social vulnerability interacts with disasters, including COVID. So it included 180 barangays, that's all of Iloilo City's barangays. And we used 2015 census data and 2017 barangay profile. It covered 18 variables or indicators of social vulnerability, age, sex, population density, dependency, housing, and so on. And we used factor analysis using principal components method for index construction. For our results, just to give a brief background of Iloilo City. Iloilo City has a population of 457,626 as of 2020. Then there are 180 barangays. in the city, and it has a land area of 78.34 square kilometers. As of October 8, 2021, COVID cases totals 21,804 cases. That is about 15.4% of Region 6. Region 6, by the way, is I think this number 5, fifth in terms of COVID cases in the country, around 141,000. And in Iloilo, there is 547 died of COVID. That is about 2.4%, the mortality rate. So if you look at the social vulnerability index of Iloilo, the important factors that contribute to social vulnerability of the barangays are dependency, access to safe water, gender, literacy, housing materials, and house ownership. These factors explain about 75.42% of the variation in the data. And this is the social vulnerability map of Iloilo City. And we classified social vulnerability into low, moderate, high based on standard deviation. And these are the barangays with low and moderate and high vulnerability scores. As you can see, 67% or 1/3 of Iloilo is classified under moderate social vulnerability. If Iloilo, by the way, is not really a poor Iloilo City, I mean, not the poverty incidence is not very high. It's a first-class income city. So if you are to look at social vulnerability and the COVID-19 cases, what we did is just integrate social vulnerability index with COVID-19 exposed barangays, that is based on the data at the time, August 2020, from the Iloilo City DOH. So these barangays at risk totals 81 with a population of around of almost 300,000. That is about 65% or 65.8% of the city. Majority are females, and 10% are young dependents, and old dependents 6%. The dependency ratio is quite high, so at 47.2%. Those who are not literate are 2.6%. Persons with disability are total is about 1.8%. So if you look at the top 5 barangays that are with the highest cases of COVID at that time, you will see their social vulnerability. So the total population of these barangays is about 26,000 or 6,500 families. The population density is 30,000 per square kilometers. This is actually quite high because the average population density of Iloilo City is just 5,800. And males are 49.7%. 5 years old and below is 12.6%, 65 years old and above is 5.2%. A dependency ratio reflects the Iloilo City's dependency ratio, which is 47%. And about 84.5% of these barangays do not have access to level 3 water or piped water from the district, from the water district. Most of them rely on community water pumps and tube wells. 100% of these barangays are classified under moderate social vulnerability. So what are some of the implications? We've seen that the top barangays exposed to the virus have around 26,000 people or 6,500 families when the study was conducted. These are areas that are also densely populated, which makes physical distancing more difficult in these areas. These are also areas that are that comprised of a lot of informal settlers. 84.5% of the households in these barangays lack access to level 3 sources of water sources, which means that It is difficult for a majority of the people in these communities to practice preventive health and sanitation practices, such as simple as frequent hand washing. So some recommendations: the study recommends activation of local or community-based health protocols involving community-based organizations and volunteers. Come up with strategies or innovations in disinfection that are less water sensitive for communities lacking water access. Lessons from social vulnerability analysis. The social vulnerability analysis shows the important factors that contribute to the inherent vulnerability of communities and how these influence risks in disaster situations, such as COVID. So as you can see earlier, we've seen that people who are in highly vulnerable communities do not have access to water, so they are densely populated and so on, which will exacerbate COVID-19 impacts in the community. The scale of analysis is also important. Since assessment is at the barangay level, local conditions are captured for contextualized, specific, targeted, and appropriate interventions. In fact, this analysis was already adopted by the local government unit in analyzing COVID situation. Right now, they are doing the daily announcements of COVID cases at the barangay level. So thank you for your attention. Just to acknowledge, the study is part of the Transdisciplinary Action Research carried out under the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines, and it's a collaboration between the Manila Observatory, Ateneo de Manila, Ateneo Innovation Center, National Resilience Council, University of the Philippines, Visayas, and the city government of Iloilo City. Mayong gabi and madaming salamat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. De Fiesta, for a very interesting presentation. So again, if you have any questions, you may post them on the chat box, or you may air them orally during the open forum, which will be held after our last speaker. So our last speaker is Mr. June Espia, an assistant professor at the UP Visayas. He is also a PhD candidate at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Canterbury. He is also a recipient of New Zealand scholarships of the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Now, his research interests include state civil society relations, disaster risk management, local governance, policymaking, and elections. Please welcome with me, Mr. June Espia.
Good afternoon. Good morning to those in the US. Very early morning here in Christchurch. It's 1 a.m. So recentralization and pushbacks in pandemic countermeasures, the case of Iloilo City. So full disclosure, the paper that I'm going to read today is actually been read by Dr. Her in the plenary session earlier, a couple of days ago. And the Philippine response, as earlier papers demonstrate, had been short on many things, but not on controversy. One recent example, in June 2001, the mayor of Iloilo City made national headlines by publicly contesting the national IATF's enhanced community quarantine classification for the city and calling out national government's failure to provide the city shares of vaccines and ventilators. Mayor Jerry Treñas has been a vocal critic of the administration's pandemic response and one of the few highly urbanized city mayors navigating the difficult terrain outside the Malacanang's patronage network. As a city whose leaders are identified with the opposition and with an ill reputation in the administration's war on drugs, it has been labeled as the most shabulized city in the Philippines. The relationship between the city and national government is fraught with difficulties at the onset. And we remember how this played out. In typical Duterte fashion, the administration first downplayed the pandemic, but since then, the president has been granted unprecedented emergency powers to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. The powers granted to the president, while only temporary, was only subject to certain congressional oversight and has not been granted to any constitutional president of the Philippines since Manuel L. Quezon in 1941 in the Pacific War against Japan. The powers conferred to the president include the direction, regulation, and limitation the operation of private businesses and take over those that refuse to comply with the directives. And all of these powers came along with the expectation that central government is going to play a primary role in the COVID-19 response in the Philippines. So what our paper does here is it analyzes Iloilo City's COVID-19 pandemic response within the prism of the national government's centralized apparatus under the Interagency Task Force on the Management of Infectious Diseases, or the IATF, and the President's attenuated emergency powers. It aims to do these three things: describe and analyze national and local dynamics in the pandemic response, map the city government's linkages with business and the academe, alongside bridging efforts with higher level actors to secure alternate access to resources, and illustrate the dynamics between central government and a highly urbanized city whose mayor is unaligned, lacks close ties to Malacanang, and has pushed back on IATF impositions and has used institutional means for favorable accommodation. This next slide actually is withdrawn from Dr. Capuna's earlier paper, which was presented earlier. And you'll see here that the 7-day moving averages in most of LGUs in the Philippines first peaked in August to September 2020, and then again in March and April 2021. If you could see the graph for Iloilo, Iloilo experienced a longer period of high daily cases than some of its neighbors, for instance, Bacolod, from August to December 2020. But much like the rest of the Philippines, from April 20 to April 2021, Iloilo City's quarantine classification can be likened to an alphabet soup, and it has changed so much from ECQ to GCQ to MECQ and to ECQ and back again. And between March 2020 and September 2021, Iloilo's quarantine classification changed 8 times. And how we're looking at all of this is from the lens of network governance. So the Philippine response to the pandemic can be analyzed as a form of highly centralized network governance at a national scale through the IATF, anchored in the president's attenuated powers under the state of emergency. The IATF is more than just a coordinated platform for both national agencies and local offices. Its remit is broad, including making decisions as to which areas will be put on community quarantine and for how long, the entry into and movement of locally stranded individuals and returning OFWs, school closures, restrictions on public gathering, and access to emergency relief and government-procured vaccines. It has regional, provincial, and city-level iterations with local government units represented by their chief executives, governors, or mayors, for instance, as members. Using this network governance model, we will examine the role of Mayor Trenes as the lead and hub of responses encompassing not just local government offices, but also the health, business, and NGO sectors that reach and much needed resources for the response. Mayor Trenes, as boundary spanner between the city's residents and the IATF, although he is looking like he's against the political grain, is also analyzed accordingly. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the city, Iloilo sits at the southwestern edge of Panay Island in the Western Visayas region. It is classified as a highly urbanized city and a regional center in Region 6, although in comparison to other highly urbanized cities outside of Metro Manila, for instance, Davao and Cebu, Iloilo City has a relatively smaller population in comparison to these larger metropolitan areas. Now, initially, at one point, Iloilo was dubbed as the Wakanda of the Philippines for its innovations in the pandemic response, despite the lack of a strong connection to Malacanang. We looked at Iloilo City response and pushback to centralization across these 5 areas: contact tracing and testing, community quarantine classification, access and distribution to vulnerable populations, repatriation of overseas Filipinos and locally stranded individuals, and the balancing act between health risk and economic reopening. In terms of contact tracing and testing, initially, Philippine samples had to be flown to Australia, and then we developed ours in our ATM in Quezon City. And at the city level, testing was deemed very important early. The city utilized its connections with universities and private hospitals to set up 3 RT-PCR capable labs. Then it eventually established its own laboratory. The city also considered mandatory testing for recoveries, even when this was not previously required by the IATF. The city also early on required a notice of coordination acceptance from the city government, aside from the negative RT-PCR test for LSIs and returning overseas Filipinos before they can be allowed to come into the city, which is a total opposite of what the IATF is directing them to do. Now, the community quarantine classifications in the Philippines have been really top down. LGUs are expected to comply With this, under the threat of show cause orders, Iloilo tried to harmonize local guidelines with that of their IATF omnibus guidelines. It has also been very incessant about appeals, and particularly in the part of Mayor Trenias. And as was mentioned earlier, Iloilo has changed its quarantine status 8 times in between April 2020 to April 2021 last year. And in fact, there's been a lot of frustration over the ever-changing community quarantine classification, which actually culminated in a very public spat between Mayor Trenias and some DILG officials over in July 2021. The flip-flopping by the IATF, in fact, angered Trenias, and he then blew his top at one DILG undersecretary in an online consultation with our local chief executives in the region. In the meeting, Trenias openly questioned the factual basis of the IATF's decision and the lack of consultation with local officials, which not a lot of local chief executives have been able to do. In terms of providing access to resources for vulnerable populations, the city received around 95 million from the national government through the Bayanihan Act. Most of the money, as you can see in the table, was spent for things like medical supplies, equipment, food aid, as well as the building of its city's own testing laboratory. However, 95 million is not enough to go around. The city on its own has already shelled out close to 300 million for essentials for 70,000 low-income households, because many of these are not covered by the Bayanihan Act. And soup kitchens and pantries, around 240 of them, were set up all over the city way before community pantries and soup kitchens were a thing in the Philippines. The city government has also raised a lot of money for PPEs for medical workers and has started very early on tax deferment for businesses and assistance to ambulant vendors. The city government also created the Iloilo City Coordinator Response to defeat the epidemic team, or the code team, whose remit and composition is far bigger than the city DRRMC. In terms of repatriation, and this is a tricky issue, in terms of repatriation of LSIs and overseas Filipino workers, overall, the city was not happy about the sudden influx of LSIs on FWs at various times last year, and has in fact requested for moratorium on their arrival at various points. As we look at the dates in there, despite national government allowing for such movement of people in the middle of a pandemic. And it's interesting to note that border control in Iloilo differed slightly from its counterpart HUCs all over the Philippines. It's a mixture of civilian and government security forces, unlike, for instance, Cebu, where you see a stronger military presence. So in terms of land borders, you have a mixture of PNP, the Army, and the Iloilo City Public Safety and Traffic Management Office, as well as the Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Office. Sea borders are manned by the COVID-19 Task Force, the Coast Guard, and other national government agencies such as the Bureau of Quarantine, the DOH, OWA, and Marina. And within the city, it's mostly barangay officials who are doing the border controls, except in areas where there are surgical lockdowns. This happened quite a few times last year. Under these areas, surgical lockdowns are carried out by the PNP and the AFP. And as the pandemic wore on, the city has shown to have been moving towards a balancing act between the health risk posed by COVID-19 and economic reopening. And one of the early signs of this is harmonization of the city guidelines with IATF guidelines on most things, including the opening and reopening of businesses, establishments. But the city all throughout refused to totally close borders to workers from surrounding provinces. The city also, beginning in the first half of 2021, has resorted to surgical lockdowns as opposed to citywide lockdowns. And it was also among the first LGUs to have allocated funds for the purchase of vaccines and has embarked on a massive information campaign to get people vaccinated to address issues like vaccine hesitancy, and has established a number of facilities all over the city to conduct said vaccinations. Now, what has enabled largely Iloilo to do a lot of this because of its lack of, a strong patronage network to Malacanang and its limited access to national resources are local networks and horizontal relationships. First, the city shares relatively harmonious relationships with neighboring LGUs. The city government has leveraged its good relationships with other LGUs surrounding the city. Some of these LGUs already share a working relationship with the city government through the Metro Iloilo and Guimaras Economic Development Council, or the MEGEDSI, whose primary trust is metro governance and metro planning. But while coordination for the COVID-19 did not happen through the MEGEDSI, prior working relationships were key in ensuring good coordination. The city government also worked extensively with the Iloilo and Antique provincial governments, where most of Iloilo City's workforce come from. Mayor Tranis's good relationship with the Iloilo governor and the Antique governor was instrumental in keeping the city borders open for both workers and goods. It's interesting that Iloilo also elects a lone district representative. Because of their representatives' access to national government, it is oftentimes seen by barangay officials as an important source of funding for big-ticket projects, along with the office of the city mayor. The current representative, Representative Baronda, is a longtime Trias ally. Because of her former post as chief of staff of Senator J.V. Ejercito, she was able to connect the city government to national government agencies for assistance to things like assistance for market vendors, livelihood assistance for city residents, scholarship grants to help the city recover from the pandemic, as well as emergency response vehicles for the city's frontliners. However, Baronda's attempt to improve her relationship with the Duterte administration by being generally supportive of the national government's controversial plans and her public miscuses caused friction between her and Mayor Trenes. For instance, over the issue of repatriation of OFWs to Panay Island who were stranded in Metro Manila through the national government's controversial Malasakit voyage, some who later tested for the COVID-19 pandemic. And because many of the people that were brought in were done without coordination, it earned the mayor's ire. We resorted to calling Representative Baronda as secretary of the IATF. Baronda, along with Vice Mayor Ganzon and some city councilors, were also issued citation tickets for violating a city ordinance on physical distancing because of a series of gatherings to distribute financial aid from the DSWD. And to top it all off, Representative Baronda was also cited along with the Western Visayas Fire Marshal for attending the blessing inauguration ceremony of a fire substation in one Iloilo district, which is a violation of a ban on unauthorized mass gatherings. They were subsequently asked to render community service by helping one of the city's community kitchens under the supervision of the Iloilo City COVID-19 compliance team. And because the city is around 70,000 disadvantaged households, it relied heavily on donations from civil society and private sector from within and outside the city to run its relief operations, the community kitchens, and its quarantine and testing efforts. The city government initially shelled out 12 million for the relief operations or for the community kitchen project and mobilized daycare workers, parent leaders of the 4Ps to help with the food preparation and distribution. And aid came in the form of things like the Pandesal program of the Iloilo Bakers Association, masks, PPEs, testing kits. Civil society and private sector groups were also instrumental in the city's vaccination efforts by allowing schools to be used as quarantine zones and as vaccination areas. The readiness to lend support has also translated into open and vocal political support for the mayor's strategy of openly sending letters of appeals to national government. For example, in May and June 2001, when Mayor Trinas called the seeming lack of priority for Iloilo City and Region 6 in terms of vaccine doses and other forms of aid, a number of organizations also wrote letters to the national IATF to support the mayor's call. And support from civil society and the private sector also came from other actors outside of the city. For instance, the National Resilience Council helped the city develop and manage a database on the COVID-19 pandemic to track and build things like heat maps. It also received a lot of aid from the Lopez Group of companies and from the Ayala Foundation for things like laboratory equipment, test kits, and computer units for teachers and students. And what can be drawn from the experience of Iloilo and the rest of the Philippines is that national government didn't just gatekeep. It, in fact, it imposed its will on localities on the pretext that its informant formula would work in arresting the spread of the virus. The IATF decided on quarantine measures, standardized quarantine classifications, testing protocols, border control, and inter-island mobility of thousands of repatriates, OFWs, and LSIs. Those decisions took the form of orders which LGUs can defy at the risk of being sued or appealed. The Iloilo City government's dyad relationship with centralized government apparatus was tumultuous and comprised a small node compared to other Malacanang preferred highly urbanized cities. Think, for instance, Cebu or Davao. This link enabled institutionalized access, however, to national government resources for emergency response, but as expected, relationships across local government was highly asymmetric. Iloilo's position as an highly urbanized city and regional commercial hub gives the city government more leg room to use its own revenue and to tap other resources for its response. But as you can see, as the year progressed, late 2020, early 2001, it was fairly evident that the national government-led and conceived pandemic response was not bringing down the number of cases. By third quarter of 2020, the IATF ceded much of power to LGU's tailor-fit measures according to the respective goals of balancing economic reopening and public health safety. And Iloilo City illustrates a case of a city LG whose position as a highly urbanized city and regional commercial hub makes it less reliant on national government injections for its pandemic response. Thank you very much.
Thank you, June Chris. May I mention as well that Mr. Espia is actually a PAASE fellow, and he was one of the early applicants and was announced to be a PAASE fellow early on. I believe I should mention that, and I'm sure it's appreciated. Okay. At this point, we would like to open the floor for questions. First, I will read the question that was typed in by Dr. Raul Fabella in the chat. So there are two questions. One is directed to Dr. Capuno and Mr. Espia. It goes like this. Does the Philippines COVID crisis management performance fall as dismally as the Bloomberg rating by yardstep competition or by the lens that Mr. Spia's presentation took, which is in terms of providing access to resources to local governments? And then the other questions directed to Sarah and Jeff. Great, good results, great. In Europe, one country, Sweden, stood out for resisting economic lockdown. Did the economic toll, that is output fall and unemployment impact of COVID-19, turn out to be much lower in Sweden than in Europe as a whole? So Sweden, of course, went the opposite direction. Rather than do that, they just simply did nothing. So I think the general interest is that did it produce the same or different sort of results in terms of unemployment for Sweden as it is for other cases in Europe? Okay, so I think at this point, maybe we can ask Mr. Espia and Dr. Capuno to respond, and then Sarah and Jeff after. June Chris?
Right. Does the Dr. Capuno want to go first?
Okay. This is a tough one. Yeah, I'm not sure the Philippine government is playing one-upmanship game with its neighbors to make the yardstick competition model applicable. You know? I'm not sure really because the proper comparison then would be other countries. I know we did not do very well relative to, say, Vietnam, for example. Yeah, the same level of poverty, the same population size, but they were able to manage their control. In fact, the spread very well done we did. But other than that, I'm not sure how to compare Philippines with with other countries using the yardstick competition model. Sorry, Raul, I could not say anything more about
That's all right. But the Bloomberg rating puts the Philippines as last among about 50 countries or something. That's all.
Yeah, but the Philippines is in the bottom of the ratings, so almost any rating, the recovery index, resiliency index.
The Nikkei Asia report that was released a few days ago put us dead last as well in terms of
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
It's but in terms of COVID incidents, we're not the last. I think we're the 18th in the world, but not. We used to be number 9, I think, in April or March, but now we're in the top 20. Still bad, but I don't know. But what we're doing is we seem to be doing very well relative to Indonesia. Yeah? Indonesia has higher incidence rate. I don't know their Bloomberg ranking, maybe better than us because we are at the bottom of the ranking. Yeah?
You have to relate it to population, Dokoy.
Yeah, you're right.
Much bigger
but Indonesia and Philippines have the same size. Huh? Well, they are
Oh,
bigger.
no.
Vietnam
No,
has
3 times. Indonesia's
siguro.
around 3
Yeah,
times.
bigger.
Yeah, 3 times. Yeah.
Yeah, but Vietnam is as big as us. Yeah, nearly as big. Yeah, about 100 million. But
Yeah,
they're
about
doing very well.
100 billion. But Vietnam's poverty incidence is much lower than ours.
Yeah.
But, it's not the same.
Yeah.
And Vietnam just caught up with us in terms of GDP per capita last year because they grew and we contracted a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe Ernie is the better, is the better resource person for this question.
What is the question?
Ito kay Raul. Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think we already discussed it.
Yeah.
By by exchanging,
Okay. Thank you so much for the question, Dr. Fabella, and for the response, Dr. Capuno. June Chris?
It's there's a lot of other countries protesting their status as well in the Bloomberg rating. I think part of the reason why we're rated so low is that if you look at how it started since last year, I think very early on we dropped the ball early. We dropped the ball in a sense that we weren't too nimble, we weren't quick enough, and things have just gone from bad to worse. And I'm thinking about this in if you think about an apples and oranges comparison of, let's say, New Zealand and the Philippines. And I'm currently in Christchurch, and New Zealand was like number 1 sometime last year. Now it's way down, and part of the reason was that the dropping of the ball was not in terms of the public health response and the economic lockdown, but in terms of getting the vaccination rates up. We were way too slow, and we were a country whose GDP per capita is more than 10 times, I think, that of the Philippines. So for us, the COVID-19 was just another layer of into the existing, as Dr. De Fies's presentation already shown, it's just another layer of set of hazards that are interacting with existing social vulnerabilities, among them poverty, incident rates, and so on. But if you think about it from a yardstick competition perspective, I think by the time that data come out, Indonesia's case is not as bad as yet as of what's happening now. But I think now Indonesia is faring far worse than the Philippines. So I think insofar as Southeast Asia are concerned, we're not really the worst, but maybe we're second or third, somewhere in there. Definitely not the last. That's my sense of
Thank
the.
you. Thank you, June Chris. And now for Sarah and Jeff, regarding the Sweden, again, as a maybe counterintuitive case in terms of how it approached the whole pandemic and the response it took.
Yeah, so Jeff, would you like to go or should I?
You can go ahead. No,
Okay. All right. So thank you, Sir Fabella, for this this insight here regarding Sweden. Thank you for this question. And well, it turns out that there is an article that looks at the unemployment performances of 4 Nordic countries. So there is Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. And as it turns out, when unemployment is defined in terms of, well, number of unemployed as we usually defined it, and those who were furloughed, Sweden really did much better than the other Nordic economies. As we know, Denmark, Finland, Norway, all of them imposed harsher measures, lockdown measures, and so their hospitality sectors, personal services sectors took a big hit. Unlike Sweden, that opted not to impose any lockdown measure. Now, since we're on Zoom, maybe I can share the screen so I can show you the article, or at least the numbers or the graphs here. So we have here new unemployment. In this article, they also included the number of furloughs. So the blue line here indicates the new unemployment numbers, and plus the number of furloughed workers for Sweden. That's blue. Green one is Norway. Yellow, Finland. Denmark is red. And as we can see here, please looking at the peak and thereafter, Sweden did much better in terms of unemployment numbers and those who were furloughed. And it's the same in terms of cumulative unemployment and furloughs. It's Sweden that did the best, at least in this group of 4 Nordic countries.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Extremely informative. I once wrote a little piece on Sweden in the beginning of the pandemic. And I thought that Sweden was bucking the tide, and it will pay a higher price in terms of deaths, but it might recoup in terms of reduced economic losses. And what you said seems to bear that out.
Although the caveat is that they just looked at 21 weeks, it's pretty much short term. So the verdict is still out in terms of the long-term effects of this, but at least the short-term effects, the numbers are looking comparatively better than the rest of its neighbors.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much again for all your questions. I look at my panel here and I don't see anyone raising a hand. So we are actually 8 minutes past our time, and there is another session that will happen, I think a business meeting for PAASE. So at this point, on behalf of my co-chair, Sarah, and the members of the REC 13, the Research and Expertise Cluster 13, Social, Economic, Political, and Cultural Sciences, we'd like to thank you, our speakers, Dr. Secretary Pernia, Dokoy Capuno, Sarah and Jeff, Dr. Di Fiesta, and Mr. Espia for your presentations today. I would like to thank as well Dr. Favelia and others who had such keen interest in joining our panel presentations today. So I think moving forward, we would like to kind of see this sort of discussion about a policy that really affects us, and we're very happy. I think we're the only panel in PAASE that looks at COVID-19 as an entirety and looking at varying aspects. So we hope that this sort of synergy and intersections will be felt as well in subsequent PAASE webinars under Rector team. Okay, so I think I will leave it to you, Sarah, if you have any final points.
No, I would just thank you, Ma'am Rosaline. I would just like to thank everyone again for coming. No, this is it's really late already, but still you're here. No, and yes, we hope that everyone has a good evening. Keep safe.
Thank you very much.
Be safe.
See you and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Ma'am Rosalie, Sir Fab. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you can turn off the recording now?
Yes.
Okay.